Hello, and welcome to Read Along with Heather. Today, we will be reading Curious George Goes to the Hospital by Margaret and H.A. Rey. This is George. He lived with his friend, the man with the yellow hat. He was a good little monkey, but he was always curious. Today, George was curious about a big box on the man's desk. What do you think is in it? What could it be? George could not resist. He simply had to open it. It was full of funny little pieces in all sorts of shapes and all sorts of colors. George took one out. It looked like a little piece of candy. Maybe it was candy. Maybe he could eat it. George put the piece in his mouth, and before he knew it, he had swallowed it. A while later, the man with the yellow hat came home. "Why, George," he said, "I see you have already opened the box with the jigsaw puzzle. It was supposed to be a surprise for you. Well, let's get to work on it." Finally, the puzzle was finished. Well, almost finished. One piece was missing. The man looked for it everywhere, but he could not find it. "That's strange. It's a brand new puzzle." "Well, it cannot be helped. Maybe we'll find it in the morning. Let's go to bed now, George." The next morning, George did not feel well. He had a tummy ache and did not want to eat his breakfast. The man was worried. He went to the telephone and called Dr. Baker. "I'll be over as soon as I can," said the doctor. First, Dr. Baker looked down George's throat and felt his tummy. Then he took out a stethoscope and listened. "I'm not sure what's wrong," he said. "You better take George to the hospital and have an x-ray taken. I'll call them and let them know you're coming." "Don't worry, George," said the man when they were driving to the hospital. "You have been here before when you broke your leg. Remember how nice the doctors and nurses were?" George held his big rubber ball tight as they walked up the hospital steps. A nurse took them down a long hallway to a room where she gave George something to drink that looked white and tastes sweet. "It's called barium," the nurse explained. "It helps the doctors find out what is wrong with you, George. Nowadays, you don't have to drink it anymore." In the next room stood a big table, and a doctor was just putting on a heavy apron. Then he gave the man one just like it. George was curious. Would he get one too? No, he did not. "You get on that table, George," the doctor said. "I'm going to have to take some x-ray pictures of your insides." He pushed a button, and there was a funny noise. "There. Now you may get up, and we will have the x-ray developed right away." "Now let's see. There was something there that should not be," said the doctor when they were looking at the x-rays. "Why, that looks like... I think that must be the puzzle that was missing in our jigsaw puzzle yesterday," said the man. Well, said the doctor. "At least we know what's wrong with our little patient. I'll tell Dr. Baker right away. George will have to stay at the hospital for a few days. They'll put a tube down his throat and get the piece out. It's only a small operation. I'll call a nurse and have her take you to the admitting office." Many people were waiting outside the office. George had to wait too. "Look, Betsy," the woman next to him said to her little girl. "There's Curious George." Betsy smiled up for a moment, but she did not even... Betsy looked up for a moment, but she did not even smile. Betsy had never been to a hospital before. She was scared. Finally, it was George's turn. A pretty young nurse took him to the next room. My, how many rooms and how many nurses there were. One nurse wrote down a lot of things about George. His name and his address and what was wrong with him. Another nurse put a bracelet around his wrist. "It has your name on it, George," she said, "so that everybody knows who you are." Then the pretty young nurse came back. "My name is Carol," she said. "I'm going to take you to your room now. We call it the children's ward, and put you to bed. There'll be lots of children to keep you company." And so it was. There were a lot of children in the room. Some were up and around, others were in beds, with a doctor or a nurse looking after them. Dave was having a blood transfusion. Steve had his leg bandaged and was sitting in a go-kart. Betsy was in bed looking sad. George got the bed next to Betsy. George was glad when he was in bed at last. His tummy was hurting again. Luann sat with him for a while. "Now I have to leave you, George," he finally said. "I'll be back first thing in the morning before they take you to the operating room. Nurse Carol will tuck you in when it's time to sleep." Then he left. George just sat there and cried. As he had promised, the man was back early next morning. The nurses were keeping George very busy. One nurse was taking his temperature, one was taking his blood pressure, one was giving him a pill to make him feel sleepy, George, she said, and one was getting ready to give him a shot. "Yeah, shots hurt." "It's going to hurt, George," she said, but only for a moment. She took his arm and George let out a scream. "But the needle hasn't touched you yet," said the nurse, laughing. "There, now it's done. That wasn't so bad, was it?" "No, it really was not. And anyway, it was all over now. I remember getting 2 shots and it just didn't really hurt as much as I expected it to be." By the time the attendant came with the stretcher to wheel him to the operating room, George was getting sleepy. He tried hard to stay awake. He was curious to see what was to happen next. He could see a big table with bright lamps over it and doctors and nurses all around. They had caps on their heads and masks over their faces, only their eyes were showing. One of the doctors winked at George and patted his head. It was Dr. Baker, who had been to the house where it had all started. He looked funny with his mask on. And then George was fast asleep. When George woke up, he did not know what had happened. He did not even know where he was. Then he saw Nurse Carol. "It's all done, George," she said. "They got the piece out. In a day or 2, you'll be running around again." The man had brought him a picture book. But George felt sick and dizzy. His throat was hurting, too. He was not even curious about the new book. He closed his eyes again. "We'll let him sleep," said Nurse Carol. "The more he sleeps, the better." The next morning, George felt better. He even ate a dish of ice cream. I love ice cream. Dr. Baker came to see him, and the man, of course, came too. I actually remember getting a meal in a hospital once for whenever I had an allergic reaction. Although I wasn't really hungry, I had the peaches they gave me. Betsy was watching him from time to time. She seemed a little less sad, but she still did not smile. Steve wheeled his go-kart over to George's bed. "Tomorrow I can get up and try to walk," he said. "Boy, I can hardly wait." "I'll take you to the playroom now, George," Nurse Carol said the next morning. "And in the afternoon your friend will come and take you home." The playroom was full of children. A lady was showing Betsy how to use finger paint. There were all sorts of things to play with, even a puppet theater. And that was just the thing for George. He had 4 hands, so could handle 4 puppets at the same time. George gave a real puppet show with a dragon and a clown and a bear and a policeman. The children laughed and shouted, and even Betsy for the first time smiled a little. Good for Betsy. There was a TV set in the playroom and also a record player. George was curious if he climbed on the record player and turned on the switch. Would it go around and round like a merry-go-round? It did. It started slowly, then it went faster and faster, and whoopee! George had lost his balance and was sailing through the air. Luckily, George landed on a soft cushion. The children cheered and smiled again. George was so funny. But then the play lady picked George up. "That's enough for now," she said. "You better take a nap before lunch. We have a big day ahead of us." The mayor is coming to visit to the hospital today, and later on you will be going home, said George. When George woke up, Steve was just taking his first steps. A nurse was helping him, and the children were watching. The go-kart was standing there empty. George was curious. He looked at it. Then he climbed into it. Then he grabbed the wheels, and then while nobody was looking, he wheeled the go-kart right out of the room. George could make the go-kart go very fast. This was fun. Down the hall he went. By now the nurse had noticed that he was gone and came running for him. "George! George!" she hollered. But George was too excited to listen. He wheeled around the corner and down the ramp to the floor below, where some men were busy pushing lunches carts and lots of doctors and nurses were showing the mayor around. The mayor looks like a really important person here. George tried to stop, but it was too late. Wham! The go-kart landed right in the middle of everything. Lunch carts tumbled, spinach and scrambled eggs and strawberry jam were all over the floor. It might sound yucky, but it still sounds delicious. People fell over each other, and George was thrown out of the go-kart and landed right in the mayor's arms. What a mess it was! You broke all my dishes, someone cried. He ruined the go-kart, complained another. What will the mayor think of this? Whispered someone else, and so it went. Suddenly, everybody looked up and listened. From above came happy laughter, and there stood Betsy, laughing, laughing, and laughing. Then the children joined in. Then the mayor started laughing, and finally everybody just laughed and laughed. Everybody, that is, except George. Betsy came running down the ramp, threw her arms around George, and kissed him. Don't be sad, George, she said. The whole thing was so funny. I've never laughed so much in my life. I'm so glad you were in the hospital with me. Now the director of the hospital spoke. I'm sorry this happened, Mr. Mayor, he said. But I think we'll just clean up the mess and be done with it. George, he went on, you've made a terrible mess. But you also made our sad little Betsy happy again. And that is more than any of us has done. And now I see your friend has just come to take you home. So goodbye, George, and take good care of yourself. The children crowded around the windows, waving goodbye, when George and the man in the yellow hat were finally leaving the hospital. As the car was turning into the driveway, Nurse Carol came running after him. Here's a little package with something that belongs to you, George, she called. But don't open it before you are home. George was curious. Well, what would not be? The moment he reached home, he ripped the paper off, tore open the box, and there was the piece of the puzzle that had caused all the trouble. How nice of the doctor to save it for us, said the man with the yellow hat. And now we can finish the puzzle. The end. That's the end of Curious George Goes to the Hospital.